Okay, welcome everybody. This is the first portion of Chapter 17, and we're going to be discussing the functional organization of the endocrine system. Bottom line, the endocrine system is a complement to the nervous system. Essentially, its job is to maintain communication between body systems in order to allow homeostasis to be maintained, and it does this through the production of chemicals by special tissues in the body that are called endocrine glands. These chemicals are secreted into the bloodstream directly without the use of a duct, which would be basically a pipe or a hose that would connect the gland to some other opening or some other organ. Basically, these compounds are just transported directly across the cell membrane into the bloodstream, and then the beating action of the heart carries them around the body, and they will then bind to receptors on target cells, which are going to be defined by the fact that they either have or they lack receptors for that particular hormone. The result will be a response in that target tissue, which will create conditions that will eventually feed back to the original endocrine organ and turn off that original secretion. So, the different classes of chemical messengers vary according to their distance across which they act. Autocrine messengers are released by cells, and they have a local effect on the same cell type from which the chemical signal was released. An example would be prostaglandin, while paracrine chemical messengers are released by cells and affect other cell types locally without being transported in the blood. Okay, so these guys hit their near neighbors. A neurotransmitter is produced by a neuron. It's secreted into the extracellular space by the presynaptic terminal. Remember, those vesicles inside the neuron contain the neurotransmitter. They then travel a short distance through the synapse, and they influence the postsynaptic cell. And the postsynaptic cell might be another neuron, it might be a muscle, it might be any number of other tissue targets. It's short-acting, and acts primarily by changing membrane potential on the target. Endocrine messengers are intercellular signals that are produced by cells of endocrine glands when they enter the circulatory system, and they affect targets at quite some distance. And the reason that this system of communication evolved in the body as a complement to the nervous system is because it's simply impractical for the nervous system to do all the work alone, because wiring up every cell in the body to the CNS would be a logistic nightmare, and in addition to that, the nervous system already consumes a massive amount of energy with the tasks that it does carry out. If we had to strap on an additional load in terms of operating all the other body cells, we would be consuming so much energy moment to moment that it wouldn't be practical to continue as a functioning organism. So you could think of these chemical messengers, these autocrines, paracrines, and endocrines, as the snail mail complement to the nervous system's email. What you're looking at here is just a chart showing you the different classes of chemical messengers, their description, some examples, and some diagrams showing you how it is they work. So, we already discussed the fact that endocrine glands secrete chemical messages into the circulatory system. Hormones are generally produced in small quantity. They're secreted into the intercellular space, transported by the circulatory system to their target somewhere else in the body, and they regulate the activity of the structures that they attach to. The ligand is the more general term for the chemical signal. Now, you might well ask, where are these endocrine glands? And you can see in the diagram here a drawing from top to bottom of the endocrine system. And so we can begin actually all the way up here in the brain and look at the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is the control center for what used to be termed the master gland of the endocrine system, which is known as the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland itself is divided into a front and a back lobe, which we call the anterior and posterior lobe. And the way that the hypothalamus regulates the activity of the pituitary gland is through two different methods depending on which lobe we're talking about. The hypothalamus essentially monitors body chemistry and body vitals, so it's able to detect things like fluid balance, body temperature, electrolyte balance, any number of chemical aspects of the body fluids. The hypothalamus is able to receive information on moment to moment. So you could think of the hypothalamus really as the command center for this entire system. The hypothalamus produces two hormones directly that are secreted by the posterior pituitary. It manufactures oxytocin and vasopressin. Oxytocin is responsible for smooth muscle contraction, so it triggers such responses as uterine contraction and also the milk letdown reflex. Its role in males is yet to be determined. It's also thought to play a role in the attachment that mothers feel towards their children. Okay, so there's some influence on brain function and psychology that has yet to be fully described. But the other hormone is more easily characterized. It's ADH. ADH stands for antidiuretic hormone, and this is your body's water-retaining hormone. And the action of ADH is simply to cause the kidneys to produce less urine, as a result increase blood plasma volume, and as a result in turn increase blood pressure. Okay, so ADH is one of the major ways that we control our blood pressure, which is an important aspect of the functioning of the circulatory system. Okay, so these hormones are actually manufactured in the hypothalamus and then secreted by the posterior pituitary, which in fact is nervous tissue. The anterior pituitary is a little different. The anterior pituitary is glandular tissue, and it is influenced by the hypothalamus through its release of hormones that are called releasing factors. These chemicals are secreted into a capillary bed known as the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system. These releasing factors are carried very quickly to the anterior lobe, where they influence the production of a wide variety of pituitary hormones. Okay, and there's quite a few of them that we'll touch on. Just to name a few, human growth hormone, which regulates the body's size, is one of the major pituitary hormones. Thyroid stimulating hormone is another one. We can list these as we go down. This is just a sort of a charcoal sketch of how the pituitary works. So we'll put these in blue. Okay, so let's indicate them by drawing them here. Okay. Okay, so we've got TSH. Okay, we've got human growth hormone. We've got adrenocorticotrophic hormone, which targets the adrenal cortex, and we'll see where that is in a minute. We've got prolactin. We also have the gonadotropins, which are FSH, which stands for follicle stimulating hormone, and LH, which stands for luteinizing hormone. And I believe that's the whole ball of wax. I don't think I've left anything out here. Bottom line is that these hormones have wide-reaching effects. FSH and LH target the gonads in males. Those are the testes. In females, those are the ovaries, and they regulate the reproductive cycle. Prolactin promotes milk production. Adrenocorticotrophic hormone stimulates the adrenal cortex to produce its steroid hormones, among them aldosterone, cortisol, okay, and to some extent the androgens that they produce. human growth hormone controlling the body's size, and thyroid stimulating hormone, which stimulates the thyroid gland to produce its hormones, thyroxine and T3. Okay, so you can see here with this panoply of hormones that the anterior pituitary has a lot to say about how the rest of the endocrine system functions. All right, so those are just a few of the important hormones produced by this organ. Obviously, a defect in hypothalamic function will produce a malfunctioning pituitary, both in the anterior and the posterior lobes. And this is one of the reasons why we often talk about the mind-body connection in certain medical disciplines as having more success in certain cases than traditional Western approaches, which simply use surgery and drugs to treat the illness. These approaches are considered to be an adjunct to traditional medical approaches, and what they do is they concern themselves with the psychology, the positive mental outlook of the patient being treated. As a result, the theory goes that if the brain is working at its optimum, the hypothalamus functions at its optimum. This causes the pituitary to function normally, and the bottom line is that the immune system and the body's other systems will all work as intended. Okay, so that's just a look at the importance of what used to be called the master gland, the pituitary. As we move down, you can see the thyroid gland, which sits right in front of your trachea. It's a butterfly-shaped gland that produces two hormones that control your body's metabolic rate, and those are T3, which goes by the name of triiodothyronine, and T4, which we know as thyroxine. It also produces a hormone called calcitonin, which has as its net effect to reduce blood calcium levels. On the back of the thyroid gland, and you can't see it in this view, are four P-shaped glands called the parathyroids. The parathyroids lie at the edge of the thyroid gland, hence the prefix para, and they produce a hormone called parathyroid hormone, which tends to elevate blood calcium levels. So calcitonin and PTH work together to keep blood calcium levels within nice tight limits. And the reason that this is important is because calcium is used for more than simply building strong bones. It's a critical component in muscle contraction, and it's also vital in normal functioning of nerve transmission, among many other processes such as blood clotting. So it's vital that we keep tight regulation on the amount of calcium in the bloodstream. The thymus is below the thyroid. This is the thymus here, okay, and this is the thyroid up here. Don't confuse the two because the names sound a lot alike. And the thymus is essentially where T cells mature before they move out of this gland and they populate the lymphatic organs and provide our defense against disease. Once they do that, the thymus will wither away and is no longer useful. The thymus sits in front of the heart and behind the sternum, and is useful up to the point where essentially that graduating class of lymphocytes is rendered immunocompetent and now is scattered throughout all the body's lymphatic tissues. Down here, we've got some interesting organs. We have the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands are really two glands in one. There is a cortex, which is the outer covering, and then there's a medulla, which is the inner core. The cortex is responsible for the production of a variety of steroid hormones, and we call these the mineralocorticoids, the glucocorticoids, and the sex steroids. So the way that you can remember this is salt, sugar, sex, from the most superficial area of the cortex to the deepest area of the cortex. And then, of course, the very core of the organ, the medulla, is responsible for the production of adrenaline. And we already know its role in the sympathetic nervous system, which is to elevate respiratory rate, to elevate heart rate, to dilate the pupils, to jack your blood sugar, to jack your blood pressure, and essentially prepare the body for fight or flight responses. And the reason that this is enhanced when we panic is because at the same time that the sympathetic division of the ANS is doing this to all our target tissues, the adrenal medulla is also flooding the bloodstream with massive amounts of adrenaline. So that's one of the reasons why when you panic, you don't immediately calm back down. Okay, so that's the role of the adrenal gland. Now, point in fact, it's important to understand that the nervous system and the endocrine system literally intersect at two places. We've already talked about one, right, which is the pituitary gland via the hypothalamus. The other place where they intersect is the adrenal medulla. The adrenal medulla is literally hooked right up to the sympathetic division of the ANS, and that's one of the reasons why it's activated when you panic. And this is another reason why a positive mental outlook is going to allow you to have better overall health, because if you're constantly stressed, you're constantly flooding the bloodstream with adrenaline, the result is going to be essentially in the short term an adaptive response, but in the long term it's going to end up suppressing the function of the immune system. It's going to play havoc with your blood sugar, and basically eventually you're going to become extremely unhealthy if you're under constant stress, due in part to the production of adrenaline, but also in part to the production of cortical hormones such as cortisol, one of the glucocorticoids. Okay, so to talk a little bit about what these steroid hormones do, we can work from the outer surface of the cortex to the core. The most superficial aspect of the cortex is responsible for the production of the salt-retaining hormone aldosterone. Basically, when aldosterone is secreted, we retain sodium and we excrete potassium. And so this is one of the ways we control our electrolyte balance, and it also indirectly controls our fluid balance, because as we retain sodium, we also retain water in the kidneys. The glucocorticoids are a cluster of hormones that regulate blood glucose, and the most powerful one is cortisol. Cortisol has the effect of elevating blood glucose levels. It also is a major anti-inflammatory, and this is one of the reasons why in the short term cortisol is adaptive. In the long term, cortisol is maladaptive to stress. Okay? So, the inner core of the cortex produces androgens. Now, what the heck are androgens? Let's write the word androgens here. Androgens. Androgens are simply testosterone mimics. That's a D there. And so your body has two sources of testosterone-like hormones, those being the adrenal cortex and the gonads. So you don't completely lose out if you lose gonadal function in terms of production of these sex steroids. It's just that the amounts that are produced by the cortex are a lot less than the amounts that are produced by the gonads. Now, the next organ we want to talk about is the pancreas, which is this organ right here that's wedged between the spleen and the duodenum. And it's a switch hitter because it's both a exocrine and an endocrine organ. Its exocrine function is to produce digestive enzymes and bicarbonate. The digestive enzymes help chemically break down the food that you eat, and we'll learn more about that when we get to the gastrointestinal system later this term. And the bicarbonate is produced to neutralize the acid that comes from the stomach. So that's its role as an exocrine organ. As an endocrine organ, it produces two hormones that regulate blood sugar: insulin, which has the effect of reducing blood sugar levels, and glucagon, which has the effect of elevating blood sugar levels. And so this is one of the ways that we keep the amount of carbohydrate, simple carbohydrate, in the plasma within nice tight limits. Glucagon is active between meals when we're not eating, and insulin is active immediately after meals in what we call the absorptive state, as a cue to the body that there's fuel in the circulatory system that cells should either use for energy, or in the case of the adipose tissue in the body, we should store as fat. Okay, so it's a switch-hitting organ. Moving down, we have the gonads. In the female, the gonads are the ovaries, and they're inside the body cavity. And in the male, the gonads are the testes. So we have a little hermaphrodite here in this drawing. And they produce the sex steroids. And these are progesterone, estrogen, and testosterone. In females, estrogen and progesterone predominate, and testosterone is made at much lower levels, while in males, the testosterone predominates, and the estrogen and progesterone are made at much lower levels. And the job of these hormones is to regulate gamete production and, to some extent, the reproductive cycle. They're cued by the gonadotropins that come from the pituitary gland. Okay, so this is one of the direct targets of the pituitary, along with the thyroid and the adrenal cortex. All right, so that's the skinny on the endocrine system, and we'll go through each of these in detail in the next two chapters as we talk about both the chemical mode of action of these hormones and where the organs are located and what they look like histologically. One of the things to understand, though, is that the endocrine system works by negative feedback primarily, with a few exceptions. And if we interfere with any aspect of negative feedback, we're going to interfere with proper endocrine function. We can take the example of the thyroid gland. Okay, the thyroid gland produces hormones that regulate our metabolic rate, and if the thyroid gland is being signaled to produce massive amounts of T3 and T4 as a result of constant stimulation from the pituitary, okay, what will happen is that the metabolic rate will rise and you'll have what we call hyperactive thyroid, but the thyroid itself really isn't the bad actor here. It's the next organ up the command chain, and this can happen due to things like a pituitary tumor, for instance, that can overproduce thyroid stimulating hormone. It can also happen as a result of autoimmune attacks on the organ that essentially switch the organ in the on position irrespective of the needs of the body and cause it to constantly produce the hormone. So that's one example of where the endocrine system can break down if the organ upstream from it in the command sequence is misbehaving. The other way that the organ can malfunction is if the target tissue is missing the receptor, and as a result, even though the hormone is secreted, the response that would normally be indicated by production of that hormone doesn't happen. And the result then is that the organ, the endocrine organ, will overwork, overproducing the hormone while it's not producing the desired effect. And what can happen is that the gland itself can enlarge, and over time it can actually become damaged. So those are just a few ways that the endocrine system can malfunction. And we'll talk about some endocrine disorders in the next two chapters. Most of them are either under or over secretion of the desired hormone, and we'll talk about the effects that this has on the body's overall function. So, if we compare the nervous and endocrine systems, both of them are associated with the brain. The hypothalamus, of course, is associated with the endocrine system and the nervous system, as is the epithalamus. And they may use the same chemical messenger as a neurotransmitter and a hormone, so it may have different uses in two different systems. Epinephrine is an example of a chemical that's both a neurotransmitter and a hormone, depending on what gland is secreting it. The two systems often cooperate with each other in order to regulate body function. The nervous system secretes neuroendocrine peptides or neurohormones into the circulatory system, and some parts of the endocrine system are innervated directly by the nervous system, the adrenal medulla and the posterior pituitary being two that come to mind immediately. What are some of the differences? Well, they differ in their mode of transport. The nervous system uses an axon via secretion of neurotransmitter, while the mode of transport for the endocrine system is the circulatory system. The speed of response is different. The nervous system acts over milliseconds, and the response is targeted and rapid, while the endocrine system is a slower system, and the targets are broader based. The duration of the response is different. The nervous system response lasts only a few milliseconds, where the endocrine system can last minutes to days to even weeks. And so what you're seeing here in this diagram is just a comparison of amplitude versus frequency, and you can see here, if we look at the endocrine system, we have this broader shoulder, whereas if we look at the nervous system, we have a much tinier window in which we act and in which the response is given. Okay, so this is how the two systems complement each other. So let's take a look at hormonal communication.
Hormonal communication generally begins with a part of the neuroendocrine system receiving sensory information and reacting by issuing a command to the body in the form of a hormone. In this example, dehydration is detected by osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus, which then directs or stimulates the posterior pituitary gland to release antidiuretic hormone, ADH. The next step is to transport the hormone molecules to target cells. This is typically done via the bloodstream. Here, ADH is transported through the bloodstream to the kidneys and blood vessels. When hormone molecules reach target cells, they will bind to matching receptors on those cells, and the hormone receptor complexes will trigger changes in the target cells. This causes the kidneys to reduce the urine volume output, thereby increasing water retention and countering dehydration. In blood vessels, vasoconstriction is increased, leading to higher blood pressure and thus countering the blood pressure drop caused by dehydration.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about some general characteristics of hormones. Hormones only last in the body the amount of time that they're in the bloodstream in their active form. The half-life is the amount of time it takes for half the dose of a particular hormone to be eliminated by the circulatory system. A long half-life generally regulates activities that remain at a constant rate through time. These hormones are usually lipid-soluble and travel in the plasma carried by proteins that allow them to dissolve in the plasma. Remember that hydrophobic and hydrophilic substances don't match, and they don't mix, and so we have to put these greasy molecules in a vehicle that will carry them around effectively, and that's what these lipoproteins do. Those that have a short half-life are generally water-soluble hormones. These might be amino acids or their derivatives, or even peptides, and they usually have a rapid onset and a very short duration. In addition to that, most of the water-soluble hormones have their receptors on their target tissue on the cell membrane, while it turns out that the hormones that are lipid-soluble actually have receptors on their target tissues that are inside the target cell. Okay, so that's a big difference. Communication is through interaction with the target cell, and the distribution is via the circulatory system. The hormones dissolve in the blood plasma, and they're either transported in a bound or unbound form, or reversibly bound to the plasma membrane. The hormones are distributed quickly because they circulate in the blood, and what you're seeing here is just a diagram showing you the difference between water and lipid-soluble hormones. Water-soluble hormones shown up top. The endocrine cell shoots the hormone directly into the bloodstream, and it simply travels to its target, okay, where it binds to a receptor on the membrane surface and triggers a response in that target cell. Now, in the production of lipid-soluble hormones, what we see is excretion directly into the bloodstream, and then very quickly what will happen is that the hormone will be bound by a lipoprotein in order to transport it through the plasma, and will be carried ultimately to its target tissue, where it will be released and it will pass through the plasma membrane, due to the fact primarily that lipid-soluble hormones don't see the plasma membrane as a major barrier to movement. They can slide right through the phospholipid bilayer without much trouble. And the receptors are either in the cytoplasm or in the nucleus. What happens next is that the receptor hormone complex will be escorted to the DNA. This will turn on certain genes, and the response desired will be. Okay, what you're looking at in these next two tables are just some examples of chemical structures of steroids. They give you some names, they give you the structures. The main thing I want you to notice here is that for the steroid hormones and the catecholamines, we have something unique in that the hormone is produced, dominated primarily by carbon-hydrogen bonds, i.e. these are hydrophobic compounds, and as a result, in order for them to be carried in the bloodstream, they have to be transported by lipoproteins that can accommodate them, and their receptors are primarily going to be inside the target cell, not on the cell membrane. This is just some more examples. These are the water-soluble hormones. Remember that they can travel directly in the bloodstream, and the receptors on their targets are going to be primarily on the membrane surface. Now, when we look at different patterns of hormone secretion, what we have to understand is sometimes a hormone is called into duty because of an acute need for the body. Sometimes a hormone is there as a way of maintaining homeostasis, and so it's going to be pretty much on all the time. In chronic hormone regulation, we have maintenance of a constant concentration of hormone. An example here shows you hormone levels fluctuating very slightly over time, but they're always there within pretty close to a tight range of concentrations. Examples of this are thyroid hormone, which is important in maintaining metabolic rate in the body. In acute hormone regulation, we see production in response to a dramatic change. In this case, this shows you epinephrine production in response to stress. And then finally, what we have is episodic hormone secretion, where due to cyclic events, cyclic monthly events in this case, female reproductive hormones rise and fall with regularity. Not as a result of response to an immediate or stressful situation. So how do we control hormone secretion? Well, negative feedback is the major way that we determine when and where we need certain amounts of hormones. Most hormones aren't secreted at a constant rate, but their secretion is regulated by several different methods. One is by the action of the substance other than a hormone on the endocrine gland. So some sort of condition in the body will produce a component, say in the blood plasma or in the body fluids, that will feed back to the endocrine gland and turn it on or turn it off. We can have neural control of the endocrine gland, where we have a direct lead via the ANS straight into the gland, causing it to turn on or off. Examples would be the adrenal medulla and or the pituitary, particularly the posterior lobe. And then we can control the secretory activity of one endocrine gland by a hormone or a neurohormone that comes from another endocrine gland. And the example here would be the hypothalamus influence on the anterior pituitary. Via these releasing factors, we know, or the body is able to regulate the production of anterior pituitary hormones. And so here we see an example of control by humoral stimuli, basically changes in body chemistry turning on or off a particular hormone. We have an endocrine cell that is going to respond when blood calcium drops by producing parathyroid hormone, which is going to stimulate osteoclasts to dissolve bone and release free calcium into the bloodstream. And then once the calcium levels begin to rise again, the endocrine cell will shut off once the calcium levels reach a certain predetermined level. Okay, there's no need to continue producing the parathyroid hormone if we've already reached our target level. And then once the calcium levels fall again, the cycle will repeat itself. Neural stimuli, example here, is via action potential impinging on the endocrine cell, causing it to secrete its components directly into the bloodstream. The adrenal medulla is a perfect example of this, where when the sympathetic division of the ANS fires, there's going to be neurotransmitter release in the adrenal medulla, causing the chromaffin cells to pump out tons and tons of adrenaline directly into the bloodstream. Okay, so this would be, in this case, a response to a stressful situation. Control by hormonal stimulus is probably one of the most common ways that we keep the endocrine system doing its job. Essentially what happens here is that the endocrine organ will produce a secretion in response to a changing condition in the body. That secretion will target an endocrine organ. The endocrine organ in turn will produce its hormone, which will target downstream tissues, and that will result in two things. Number one, the level of that hormone in the bloodstream will rise. Number two, conditions will be created by the target tissue that will turn off the original command. Okay, and so what you're looking at here could very easily describe the axis between the hypothalamus, the anterior pituitary, and in this case the thyroid gland. Okay, just as one example. So neurons in the hypothalamus release their hormone. The hormone travels in the blood to the anterior pituitary. Okay, hypothalamus talks to the pituitary. The pituitary in turn produces a hormone that might target, say, the thyroid gland. It travels in the blood, binds to its target tissue. The hormones in the target endocrine cell inhibit the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary, so as thyroxine levels rise, we cut off production of thyroid stimulating hormone releasing factor as well as thyroid stimulating hormone. So we actually impinge on this feedback system in two places, and in some instances the hypothalamus can also secrete inhibiting hormones which prevent the secretion of anterior pituitary trophic hormones. We call these inhibitory factors. Okay, so that's one of the more common ways that we control hormone production. In negative feedback, what happens is that the gland will be stimulated to produce a hormone that will create conditions that will turn off its own secretion. So example here would be the anterior pituitary generating a trophic hormone traveling in the blood to the target endocrine organ. The hormone from the target endocrine organ hits its target. The hormones from the target endocrine have a negative feedback loop on the original command structure. Okay, so it's very similar through this control of by hormonal stimuli. Okay, positive feedback is a lot less common. In positive feedback, what happens is that we create a series of changes that result in a crescendo event, which eventually turns off the entire process. So an example here might be the production of oxytocin. Okay, oxytocin is produced by the posterior pituitary in response to stretching of the uterus when the baby is beginning to be born. As the baby crowns, the uterus stretches. The neural feedback to the hypothalamus stimulates the posterior pituitary to produce oxytocin. The oxytocin in turn causes the uterus to squeeze, which forces the baby out, stretching the uterus more and repeating the cycle until the crescendo event, which is the baby exiting the birth canal. Okay, here we give an example with the anterior pituitary secreting a trophic hormone. It travels in the blood to the target endocrine cell. The hormone from the target endocrine cell hits its target. The hormone from the target endocrine cell also has a positive feedback relationship with the anterior pituitary, causing more production of that initial secretion. And this is the exception more than the rule. And the reason for that is that it doesn't tend to maintain homeostasis when you deviate the body's conditions further away from normal as a result of increasing production of the hormone and its action on its target. Okay, make sure and review this material. It will be covered on Wednesday's PRS quiz, and I'll see everybody in class.